Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe my channel. My blood turned to ice the moment Celeste Mercer slapped the passenger manifest across the polished walnut table and said my name loud enough for everyone in the private room at Casa Ladera to hear. The room smelled like coffee, orange peel and the beeswax they used on the old parquet floors. Easter centerpieces were already arranged along the windows. White lilies in cut glass bowls, blown eggs painted with gold leaf, folded ivory place cards resting on linen so crisp it looked starched into obedience. Outside, caramel sunlight flashed off the patio heaters. Inside, the chandeliers threw a warm amber glow over my father's clenched jaw, my brother's flushed neck, and the thin smile Brooke was trying very hard to hold in place. "You flew them in," Celeste said, one manicured finger pinning the paper to the table. "All of them." Gavin shoved his chair back so hard the legs scraped against the floor. "You don't get to ambush us with this circus and then sit there like you're confused." Brooke crossed her arms and angled her body away from me, but her eyes stayed fixed on my face, bright and eager in that ugly way people get when they think they're about to watch someone else fall apart. My father, Richard Mercer, stayed seated at the head of the table with both hands wrapped around his espresso cup, saying nothing, which in my family had always been its own kind of violence. The air left my lungs like I'd been punched. "My name is Amelia Sloane Mercer. I'm 39. And this is the story of how I turned one Easter disinvitation into the week my family finally lost the right to decide who belonged." Celeste lifted another sheet, this one printed with wire confirmations. Private car service from San Francisco. Charter receipts. Domestic first class. You used your home in Big Sur to stage some kind of stunt, and now you expect us to welcome you here tomorrow as if nothing happened. "Welcome me," I said. Her smile thinned. "Don't play with words." I looked around the room slowly. My father's silver cuff links glinted against the china. Gavin had one palm flattened on the back of his chair and the other jammed against his belt, chest puffed out, trying to look like outrage could substitute for intelligence. Brooke was tapping one white acrylic nail against her phone case in a perfect little rhythm, like heels striking tile. Near the doorway, Kendra from events was frozen with a portfolio pressed to her ribs, pretending not to listen and missing nothing. Gavin leaned forward. "You invited people who were deliberately cut out of this family for good reasons." "That's one way to say it," I replied. "For good reasons," Celeste repeated, sharper now. "People who stole, lied, embarrassed us, made accusations, fed stories to anyone who would listen. We have spent years cleaning up after that mess. And now you think you can drag them back for leverage." Leverage. That word landed exactly where she wanted it to. Not invitation. Not reconciliation. Not family. Extortion. Brooke finally spoke, her voice light and poisonous. "Honestly, Amelia, if you wanted attention this badly, you could have just posted something cryptic and saved us the airfare." Gavin barked out a laugh. "No. She wants an audience." I let my eyes settle on the guest list laid out near Celeste's elbow. 12 names, all Mercer approved. My father at the head. Celeste to his right. Gavin and Brooke opposite. A local judge and his wife. 2 board members from the foundation. The pastor from St. Dunstan's. Easter brunch had never really been breakfast in our family. It was alignment. It was theater. It was how loyalty got photographed. "You're disinvited," Celeste said. Kendra flinched near the door. Gavin straightened a fraction, satisfied. Brooke's chin lifted. My father finally raised his eyes to meet mine, but there was no apology there. Just the same cold arithmetic I'd seen my whole life. "She made her choice," he said quietly. I looked at him for a second longer than he liked. "Did I?" "Don't do that," Gavin snapped. "Don't sit there acting superior when you've been sneaking around behind our backs with Lydia and Daniel and God knows who else. You think I don't know what this is? You think I don't know you've been collecting grievances from every rejected branch of this family tree and promising them something in return?" The words were almost useful. Rejected branch. That was how the Mercers did it. They never admitted to cruelty. They preferred pruning language. Curating language. They didn't exile people. They protected standards. Celeste gathered the papers into one neat stack and aligned the corners with deliberate care. Her bracelets barely made a sound. "We're trying to spare you public embarrassment. If you show up tomorrow, security will turn you away. If any of your guests show up, they'll be removed. And if you circulate private family matters to interfere with trust administration, Preston Hale will respond formally on Monday. At the mention of the family lawyer, Brooke exhaled like that settled everything. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my untouched coffee. Is that all? I asked. Gavin stared at me. Is that all? You came here to accuse me of blackmail, disinvite me from brunch and threaten me with counsel. I'm asking whether we're done. Celeste's nostrils flared just once. You always did mistake composure for innocence. And you always did mistake control for truth, I said calmly. Brooke sat up straighter. There it is. My father set down his cup. Amelia. Don't escalate this. That almost made me smile. Escalate. As if they weren't surrounding me in a private room with staff nearby and documents spread across a table like evidence tags. As if I hadn't spent the last 3 months watching them prepare to do exactly what they were doing now, right down to the order of accusation. Celeste first because she loved the precision of a wound. Gavin second because he loved volume. Richard last because he preferred to look reasonable while other people dirtied their hands for him. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. Not quickly. Slowly enough that Gavin's eyes narrowed. You're not recording this, he said. No, I answered. I'm checking a flight status. Celeste laughed once. You really can't help yourself. I met her gaze. Actually, what you found wasn't leverage. It was a seating chart. The silence that followed was absolute. Gavin frowned. Brooke's tapping stopped. My father's face did not change, but I saw the muscle jump once near his temple. Celeste said, "What does that mean?" "It means," I replied, standing and sliding my chair in neatly under the table, "you should cancel the floral installation at your house." I picked up the top place card from their precious guest list and set it face down. Easter brunch isn't happening here. I left them with that and walked out through the amber light, past Kendra and her portfolio and the lilies and the polished brass coat stands, while behind me Gavin's voice rose half an octave and Celeste demanded I come back. They thought they had thrown me out of Easter. They had no idea I had already moved the holiday to a cliff above the Pacific and invited every person they had spent 20 years pretending never existed. The first person my family erased was my Aunt Lydia Mercer Santos, my father's older sister. Officially, Lydia had married beneath her station and then grown unpredictable. That was the word my grandmother Eleanor used after Celeste coached her long enough. Unpredictable. In practice, Lydia had told the truth in a room full of people who preferred price tags to honesty. She had discovered my grandfather's private settlement with a housekeeper in Salinas, refused to help bury it, and then made the unforgivable mistake of saying that money did not convert cowardice into class. After that, every invitation stopped. The second was Daniel Santos, Lydia's son, who had been treated as entertaining when he was young, inconvenient when he was honest, and intolerable when he married a middle school history teacher instead of the banker Celeste kept trying to introduce him to. The third was Evan Mercer, my grandfather's son from that same hidden affair, who had spent most of his life being acknowledged only in wire transfers routed through shell accounts. The fourth was Marisol Vega, my grandmother's caregiver, who had once called me in tears because Celeste had changed the locks on the Pebble Beach house after Marisol refused to sign off on a medication log she knew had been falsified. There were others. People reduced to anecdotes. Crossed-out names. Stories told in lowered voices over expensive wine. I didn't understand how systematic it was until I became inconvenient myself. 3 months before that Easter, I had asked a simple question about the Mercer Family Preservation Trust. Not in public. Not with drama. In my father's study, under the yellow glow of antique library lamps, while rain ticked softly against the window panes and the room smelled of leather bindings and cedar polish. I'd been reviewing a proposed easement agreement tied to a bluff stabilization project near one of the family's coastal properties, and the trust schedules did not match the last version I had seen. Names were missing. Percentages had shifted. A charitable allocation to the Eleanor Mercer Art Fund had quietly been cut in half. There was a new codicil dated 4 days after my grandmother's documented neurological episode. When I asked for the underlying signatures, Richard smiled in that slow paternal way he used when he wanted to tell me I was being emotional without using the word. "Amelia," he said, fingers steepled over a blotter the color of dried blood, "not every matter requires your intervention." Intervention. The Mercer word for noticing. I asked again. He said Preston Hale had reviewed everything. He said Gavin was handling administration. He said if I insisted on turning every family matter into discovery, I would eventually force people to treat me adversarially. That was the first warning. The second came from Marisol. She called me from a grocery store parking lot in Seaside, her voice shaking over the sound of shopping carts and wind. She told me Celeste had blocked her from seeing my grandmother months earlier, then asked if I remembered the blue leather medication notebook she used to keep in the breakfast room drawer. I did. Marisol said it was gone. She also said my grandmother had tried to give her an envelope the week before her stroke and whispered, "If Amelia asks, tell her Easter." I drove to the Pebble Beach house that same night. The place looked immaculate, which in Mercer terms meant every surface had been cleaned of evidence that anyone human lived there. Limestone foyer. Black iron lantern. A bowl of lacquered eggs on the console. Celeste met me in cream silk and said my grandmother was sleeping. When I said I would wait, she put one hand on the banister and said, "You really do enjoy making things difficult." I looked past her and saw that the family portrait wall had been rearranged. Lydia's photograph was gone. So was the old Easter picture from 2004, the one with Daniel laughing into the camera while my grandmother held a cake knife and my mother, my real mother before she died, stood beside me with her hand on my shoulder. That was when I knew this wasn't just about money. It was about narrative. About who got remembered. Who got framed. Who got cropped. So I stopped asking them for answers and started collecting my own. I called Naomi Quintero the next morning. Naomi had been 2 years ahead of me at Stanford and now ran Quintero and Bell in Monterey. She was an estate litigator with a voice like velvet over steel and the sort of patience that made other people confess more than they meant to. We met in her office overlooking the harbor, where the light came in clean through broad glass panes and landed across a walnut conference table. I handed her copies of the trust schedules, the easement packet, and a list of dates Marisol remembered. Naomi read in silence for 10 minutes, then asked for black coffee and a forensic document examiner. That was the beginning. The next few weeks taught me something my family had always counted on me not understanding. Wealth does not make people careful. It makes them repetitive. They rely on the same gatekeepers, the same assumptions, the same belief that anyone outside the velvet rope can be dismissed as bitter. Once Naomi and I started pulling threads, the pattern emerged quickly. Gavin had been using the family foundation to patch liquidity gaps in a stalled hospitality expansion near Santa Barbara. Richard had authorized bridge transfers from entities that were supposed to remain separate. Celeste had inserted herself into my grandmother's care schedule, visitor access, even correspondence. Preston Hale had signed off on documents he had not properly supervised. And layered underneath all of it was a quieter scheme. The trust amendment that narrowed the circle, concentrated voting power, and sidelined anyone likely to ask questions. Including me. My mistake, according to them, was not that I noticed. It was that I remained calm after I noticed. By mid-March, Naomi had enough to recommend immediate action. Instead, I asked for 2 more weeks. She studied me from across her desk. "You want them comfortable." "I want them committed," I said. So we waited. In that time I called Lydia first. She answered on the 4th ring from Santa Fe, suspicious and dry as ever. "If this is a holiday guilt call," she said, "save both of us the trouble." "It isn't," I replied. "I need to ask you about February of 2018, the attorney meeting at Carmel Valley Ranch, and whether Richard tried to get you to sign a confidentiality agreement tied to Eleanor's estate." There was a pause. Then Lydia said, "Now you sound like your mother." I took that as a yes. Daniel answered next, somewhere between a lunch rush and prep at his restaurant in Chicago. I could hear steel pans and the clipped cadence of a kitchen behind him. "If this is about Easter," he said, "I'm not flying across the country just to be insulted near decorative eggs. It's not at their house." Another pause. "Well, that's already better." Evan took longer to locate because Mercer Money had spent years keeping him quiet and mobile. Naomi's investigator found him outside Portland, running a marine repair shop under his mother's maiden name. When I told him who I was, he laughed once without humor. "Funny," he said. "I always figured one of you would call if a signature was needed." "Not this time," I said. Marisol cried when I asked if she would come. Not out of fear. Out of relief. I booked every ticket myself. That was what Celeste found. She always had excellent instincts for surfaces. If she had looked one layer deeper, she would have found the rest. The notarized statements, Marisol's duplicate care notes, Lydia's saved emails, Evan's settlement records, Daniel's photographs from Easter weekends that placed people in rooms they later claimed never to have entered, and Talia Morgan's archive. Talia was Celeste's former assistant. Before that, she had been my father's assistant. Before that, according to rumors Celeste pretended not to hear, she had been something less definable and more expensive. By the time I met with her, she was living in a furnished rental in Pacific Grove with 2 suitcases, a ring light, and a severance agreement Gavin had deliberately failed to sign. She wore a gray cardigan and no makeup and kept tucking one leg beneath her on the sofa like she expected to be told to leave at any moment. Sunlight came in through cheap blinds and striped the laminate floor. "I'm not trying to be dramatic," she said, wrapping both hands around a chipped mug. "I just need to know if I'm the fall person." "You are," I said. Her mouth parted. Then she nodded slowly once, like something she had already known had finally been said aloud. "They had me reprint courier labels," she said, "for documents related to Eleanor's trust. Celeste said Preston's office had a formatting issue. Gavin told me to use Richard's old signature stamp on a cover letter because the original had cosmetic defects. Later, when I asked for copies for my records, Celeste told me I was confused. Then Brooke told me very sweetly that confused girls with access to private financial records tend to ruin their own futures." I said nothing. Talia stood and crossed to a narrow desk by the window. She took out a slim silver drive and held it between 2 fingers. "I started saving things when Celeste searched my purse at the Pebble Beach house," she said. "That was the day I realized loyalty wasn't protection. It was just deferred blame." The drive contained more than I expected. Calendar entries, scans, draft letters, metadata. A deleted memo from Gavin to Preston with the subject line Easter alignment and a bullet point that read, "Keep AM off-site until unanimous signatures secured." Another from Celeste. "If Amelia insists on appearing, use charity board exposure. Remind her of reputational collateral." Reputational collateral. That was their language for humiliation. At that point, Naomi wanted to file immediately for injunctive relief. Instead, I asked her to send a narrow preservation notice and nothing more. Enough to make them nervous. Not enough to make them cautious. Then I did the one thing they would never have expected from me. I decided to host Easter. Not at a resort ballroom, not at Richard's glass museum of a house in Pebble Beach, and not at a restaurant where place cards could be weaponized. I hosted it at Cypress House, my home in Big Sur, where the cliffs dropped clean into the Pacific and the windows faced west, so the whole place filled with afternoon light. I had bought the property 2 years earlier after selling my packaging company to a consortium in Seattle. The press called it extravagant because it sat on 3 acres of wind-bent cypress and raw edge. They liked printing the number more than the address. $6 million made a better headline than the truth, which was that I bought it because the first night I stood on that terrace and heard nothing but the ocean and the low mechanical hum of the radiant heat beneath the stone floors, I understood what peace was supposed to sound like. The house itself was all glass, pale oak, brushed steel and local sandstone. Clean lines. Long horizons. No portraits of dead men. No inherited silver that had to be polished by someone else's hands. It was the first place I had ever lived where nothing had to prove anything. When I invited Lydia, Daniel, Evan and Marisol there for Easter weekend, I wasn't just making a point. I was building a witness table. Naomi understood that eventually. "What exactly are you waiting for?" she asked me the Wednesday before Easter. We were in my kitchen at Cypress House, late afternoon light sliding across the honed marble island while Teresa, my house manager, arranged blood oranges in shallow ceramic bowls for the weekend. Through the west wall, the ocean looked hard and metallic under a band of fog. "I'm waiting for them to do what they always do," I said. "Overplay." Naomi glanced at the stack of printed messages beside me. Security vendor confirmations. Floral estimates. Guest list revisions from Celeste. A draft email to the charity board. Gavin's request to Preston Hale for a cease and desist template. And if they don't, they will. Daniel arrived first on Thursday evening with 2 garment bags, a crate of pastry tools, and the expression of a man prepared to leave the second anyone behaved badly. His husband, Micah Santos, had stayed in Chicago with their twins because school was still in session, but Daniel brought photographs and enough dry wit to make up the difference. He walked through the front door, stopped at the sight of the ocean beyond the glass and said, "Well, if I have to be weaponized in a family dispute, this is the correct venue." Lydia came an hour later from Santa Fe in a camel coat and square sunglasses, carrying one overnight bag and a banker's box full of old papers tied with red string. She kissed my cheek, surveyed the limestone fireplace and said, "Your grandmother would have hated how modern this is." Which means it's perfect. Marisol arrived from San Jose on Friday morning with a small leather tote and the posture of someone who had spent years making herself unobtrusive in rooms that never deserved her care. I hugged her before she could decide whether that was allowed. She smelled like lavender soap and road dust and started crying into my shoulder almost immediately. Evan was last, broad-shouldered and weathered from years outdoors, with sea-gray eyes so much like my grandfather's that Teresa nearly dropped the tray she was carrying when she opened the door. He stood on the terrace for a long time after he arrived, one hand braced on the steel railing looking out over the cliff. "I got sent checks to stay invisible," he said finally. "I didn't know you'd all look this much like each other. It would have been easy to make that weekend sentimental. It wasn't. Not really. It was careful." It was a series of conversations around the oak dining table, under pendant lights that cast warm circles over folders and legal pads and coffee cups. Lydia walked Naomi through the 2018 confidentiality attempt. Marisol described Eleanor's medication schedule, the days Celeste interfered, the envelope with my name. Evan produced settlement records from a trust-adjacent entity Richard had used to keep him quiet. Daniel opened a hard drive containing Easter photographs spanning 15 years. Time stamps, faces, rooms, relationships, proof of who had been present when. And then Talia came. She stood just inside the front door in a navy coat, hair pulled back, hands empty except for her phone and a slim black laptop sleeve. The sky behind her had gone silver with rain. For one moment nobody moved. Daniel looked at me. Lydia's brows lifted. Evan folded his arms. Marisol went very still. Talia swallowed. "I know how this looks," Lydia said, "like a mistake." "That depends," I replied, walking toward her, "on whether you brought the server exports." Talia let out a breath that trembled and handed me the sleeve. It contained email backups, calendar records, and building access logs from the Pebble Beach House and Mercer Hospitality offices. Enough to show exactly who had been where and when during the period surrounding my grandmother's incapacitation and the trust amendment. At dinner that night, Daniel cooked roast carrots with cumin and brown butter, glazed ham for those who wanted it, and a lemon olive oil cake Marisol declared too pretty to cut. The dining room glowed with candlelight reflected in the glass walls, and outside the Pacific moved in dark bands beneath a low moon. For the first time in years, Easter felt less like performance and more like testimony. That was when Celeste lost patience. At 9:14 p.m., while Lydia was describing the last Christmas she'd spent at the Pebble Beach house before being written out of the guest list, my phone lit up with a message from Celeste. "You have gone too far. Richard is prepared to pursue all available remedies." Second later, Gavin. "You think flying in freak show relatives gives you leverage? Enjoy the house while you can." Then my father. "There is still time to handle this privately. Do not force escalation." I set the phone face down on the table. Daniel watched me over the rim of his wineglass. "Family." "Predictably," I said. Lydia held out her hand. I passed her the phone. She read the screen, smiled without warmth and handed it to Marisol, who read it and simply shook her head. One by one the messages moved around the table. By the time Talia saw them, her face had gone pale. "They're going to pin this on me," she said quietly. Naomi, who had arrived before dinner and was now seated near the fireplace with a legal pad on her lap, looked up. "Only if you let them." Talia met her eyes. "I'm done letting them." That night, after everyone had gone upstairs, I stood alone on the terrace wrapped in a wool throw while the wind came off the water sharp and cold. The house lights behind me reflected faintly in the glass. My phone buzzed twice more. "Gavin." Then Brooke. Brooke's message was almost impressive in its audacity. "I tried to warn you this would get ugly. Celeste is furious. Dad is humiliated. If you stop now I can probably calm Gavin down." I looked out at the black ocean and laughed once, softly. They still thought this was about mood management. By Saturday morning the ambush at Casa Ladera was already underway. Kendra from events had texted Teresa to confirm whether I still needed the Easter floral order delivered to Big Sur. That told me Celeste had not yet cancelled it, which meant she believed fear might still drive me back into compliance. So I drove down to Carmel for the meeting I knew they would force, let them perform their little courtroom over brunch linens, and gave them exactly enough truth to keep them reckless. After I walked out of Casa Ladera, I called Naomi from my car before I had even pulled onto Ocean Avenue. They found the flights, I said. Of course they did. They accused me of blackmail and formally disinvited me. Celeste threatened counsel. Gavin mentioned rejected branches of the family tree on record in front of staff. Naomi was quiet for half a second. Good. I thought you'd say that. Can you be in Monterey by 11 on Monday? Yes. Then enjoy your brunch. I did. Easter Sunday at Cypress House began with fog lifting slowly off the water and a pale gold light coming through the eastern clerestory windows. The kitchen smelled like coffee, cardamom, and the sourdough Daniel had insisted on baking himself because, according to him, justice tasted better with proper fermentation. Teresa set out pale green plates on the terrace table because the wind had dropped enough to eat outside. Marisol tied fresh ribbon around tiny jars of apricot jam. Lydia arranged wildflowers in low ceramic vases and criticized my choice of napkins with the deep pleasure of a woman finally allowed to have opinions in daylight. At 10:30, Evan came in from the bluff path with a folded newspaper under his arm. You're in the society column, he said. Am I? He laid it on the counter. Someone had leaked that Richard Mercer's daughter would be absent from the family's annual Easter brunch after private tensions. No source, of course. No specifics. Just enough to let people speculate. Daniel read it and snorted. The wealthy really will stage manage absolutely anything except therapy. I took a slow sip of coffee and checked the driveway camera feed on my tablet. Good, I said. Lydia looked over. That doesn't bother you? No. Why? Because if they're leaking, I replied, they're panicking. At noon my father called. I declined it. Celeste called 30 seconds later. Then Gavin. Then Preston Hale's office. I archived all of them and cut another slice of Daniel's cake while the Pacific blazed silver beneath a hard noon sun. At 2:15 Naomi texted. They sent a Sunday demand letter. Predictably sloppy. We respond tomorrow in person. I've secured the room. I sent back a single word. Perfect. That evening, as the light went amber over the deck and Daniel insisted everyone take leftovers whether they wanted them or not, I gathered the whole table for one more conversation. I need all of you in Monterey tomorrow morning, I said. Quintero and Bell. 10:30. We're not filing first. We're offering them one chance to repair what they did before it becomes public, criminal, and permanent. Evan leaned back, studying me. And if they don't take it, then we stop being polite. Lydia smiled into her wine. Your mother would have approved of that sentence. Marisol reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Your grandmother would too. I thought of Eleanor then, not as Celeste had presented her in the final years, fragile, managed, confused, but as she had been when I was 10, standing in a silk robe at the old kitchen counter with sun coming through the breakfast room windows, telling me that holidays were supposed to reveal people, not conceal them. For most of my life I thought she meant silver and flowers and proper posture. It took being disinvited to understand her correctly. Monday morning broke bright and cold. Quintero and Bell occupied the top floor of a stone and glass building overlooking Monterey Harbor, the kind of place designed to imply stability before anyone had spoken a word. The lobby smelled faintly of cedar and expensive paper. Upstairs, the main conference room was all gleaming walnut, soft gray leather, brushed nickel fixtures, and a wall of windows facing the water. The light in there was clean and unforgiving. Every smudge showed. I arrived first with Naomi and Leo Bernstein, the forensic accountant she had brought in from San Francisco. Leo was compact, silver-haired, and carried two hard-sided document cases like a man who trusted weight more than performance. Lydia sat to my left in navy wool. Daniel beside her in charcoal, suddenly sober. Marisol wore a cream blouse and held herself with such quiet dignity it made my throat tighten. Evan stood by the windows until the last minute, hands in his pockets, looking out at the boats. Talia sat near the far end of the table with a legal pad and both feet flat on the floor, as if anchoring herself. At 10:28 the other side arrived. Richard entered first, immaculate in dark suit and pale blue tie, though he looked older than he had 2 days earlier. Not weaker. just diminished as if someone had quietly removed a source of internal light. Celeste followed in ivory wool with gold earrings and a jaw set so hard I could see the strain from across the room. Gavin came in behind them, face over-controlled, phone in hand. Brooke was last, carrying a handbag too structured for that early in the morning and sunglasses she did not take off until she saw Lydia. Then came Preston Hale, flushed already with a junior associate and 2 legal pads he would not end up using. Nobody said good morning. Naomi waited until everyone had taken a seat. Then she slid a printed agenda to the center of the table. "Thank you for coming," she said in that even voice of hers. "We are here to address, in order, the validity of the March Trust Amendment, the use of Please Subscribe My Chanel Mercer Foundation funds for unrelated business support, the exclusion of beneficiaries and witnesses from estate communications, and potential civil and criminal exposure arising from those actions." Preston let out a sharp breath. "This is absurd." Naomi turned one page. "Good. Then it should be easy to resolve." Celeste looked directly at me. "You brought outsiders into a private family matter." I met her gaze. "No. I brought back the people you excluded from it." Gavin leaned in. "You don't have standing to force this." Leo opened one of the cases and began laying out binders with color-coded tabs. The sound was soft and methodical. 1 binder per issue. 1 packet per person. He aligned each stack with the edge of the walnut table as if setting a formal table of his own. "That's where you're mistaken," Naomi said. "Ms. Mercer has standing in several capacities. But more importantly, your clients have exposure regardless of standing, because paper trails do not care about guest lists." Richard's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Brooke looked at him, then away. Naomi began with the trust. She projected the original 2017 Mercer Family Preservation Trust schedule onto the screen at the end of the room. Cream background. Black serif font. Full beneficiary list including me, Gavin, Lydia. A contingent allocation to Daniel. A private annuity vehicle benefiting Evan through a mediated structure. And the Eleanor Mercer Art Fund at its original percentage. Then she projected the later amendment. Names gone. Percentages shifted. Control consolidated. The art fund reduced. Me converted from shared governance oversight to a narrower informational role. Lydia and Daniel removed entirely. Evan's mediated benefit dissolved. Celeste folded her hands. Eleanor changed her mind. Naomi clicked once. Up came Eleanor's neurologist records from February 4th, the date of execution. According to her treating physician, Naomi said, she did not possess sustained decisional capacity that day following the event of January 31st, and the medication sequence reflected in these logs. Marisol inhaled softly beside me. Preston straightened. "Those medical records were obtained improperly." "No," Naomi said. "They were produced under lawful authorization from a valid pre-existing directive your office failed to revoke because you overlooked it." That hit Preston harder than it hit Celeste. I saw it in the way his hands stopped moving over his notepad. Leo took over next, clicking through transaction flows in a series of calm, devastating steps. Mercer Foundation disbursements. Intercompany transfers. Emergency coverage for a debt servicing gap tied to a Santa Barbara hospitality expansion Gavin had championed. Timing overlap with the trust amendment. Communications referencing temporary internal smoothing. Every number supported by source documents. Every source document time-stamped. Gavin's voice cracked first. "That's not fraud. That's internal liquidity support." Leo adjusted his glasses. From a restricted charitable entity into a private commercial exposure. It was repaid. "Partially," Leo said. "After quarter close. Using proceeds traceable to a second transfer that appears to have been disguised through a vendor advance." Brooke turned toward Gavin. "You told me that project was fine." He shot her a look. "This is not the time." Naomi didn't let the silence rescue him. She moved on. How the timeline. This was the part one had wanted most. On the screen appeared a clean sequence of dates. January 31st. Eleanor Mercer experiences neurological episode at Pebble Beach residence. February 1st through February 6th. Visitor restrictions altered. Caregiver access modified. Medication log irregularities begin. February 4th. Trust amendment executed. February 5th. Foundation transfer initiated. February 8th. Lydia's prior inquiry regarding estate communication left unanswered. March 12th. Amelia Mercer requests updated schedules. March 13th. Internal email from Gavin Mercer to Preston Hale reading, "She's already asking the wrong questions." March 15th. Celeste Mercer calendar note, "Easter guest list final after AM managed." March 19th. Talia Morgan asked to reprint courier labels and prepare revised cover correspondence. March 21st. Richard Mercer message to Celeste, "We need unanimity before holiday optics." March 28th. Gavin Mercer memo, "Keep AM off-site until unanimous signatures secured." March 30th. Preservation notice received from Quintero and Bell. March 31st. Society leak regarding private tensions. April 1st. Sunday demand letter sent. The room seemed to contract around the dates. I watched Richard look at the screen without blinking. Celeste's shoulders had gone rigid, but one thumb kept rubbing the inside of her opposite wrist in tiny, frantic circles. Gavin reached for water and missed the glass on the first try. Brooke was suddenly very interested in the seam of her skirt. Preston recovered enough to say, "Calendar fragments and internal phrasing do not constitute premeditation." "No," Naomi agreed. "Which is why we also brought witness testimony and server logs." That was Talia's cue. She stood slowly, carrying no paper at all, only her own steadiness. Morning light from the harbor fell across one side of her face, leaving the other in clean shadow. "On March 19th, she said, "Celeste told me Preston's office needed new courier labels because the original addresses had changed." That was false. On March 21st, Gavin told me to prepare a revised cover letter under Richard's name and use the old signature stamp from the study credenza. When I asked whether Mr. Hale had approved that, Gavin said, "Nobody's going to litigate Easter." On March 29th, after Amelia's preservation notice, Celeste searched my bag before I left the Pebble Beach house and asked whether I had kept copies. On March 30th, Brooke told me it would be best for everyone if I remembered that assistants are replaceable. Brooke's head snapped up. "I never." Talia looked at her. Just looked. Brooke stopped. Preston turned to Richard. "Did you authorize use of a signature stamp on trust-related cover correspondence?" Richard's answer took one beat too long. "Not in those words." Naomi slid a glossy printout across the table. "Building access logs place Mr. Hale nowhere near the Pebble Beach residence on the dates his office claims direct document supervision." Preston didn't touch the page. This was where the fracture started. Gavin pointed at Talia. "She's lying because she got fired." "You didn't fire me," Talia said quietly. "You stopped answering." Marisol did not stand immediately. She placed both hands flat on the table first, gathering herself, then rose with a grace that made every expensive person in that room look smaller. "I cared for Eleanor Mercer for 3 years," she said. "She was forgetful some days, sharp on others. She loved yellow roses and overcooked toast, and she asked for her granddaughter Amelia by name during the last month I was permitted full access. On February 3rd, Mrs. Mercer instructed me to increase a medication dose earlier than usual. I refused without a physician call. The next day I was told my services were no longer required inside the residence. Before that, Eleanor tried to hand me an envelope for Amelia and said, 'Easter. Tell her Easter.' When I returned 2 days later, the blue medication notebook I kept in the breakfast room drawer was gone." Celeste's voice went thin. "You were a caregiver, not a family member." Marisol turned to her with a steadiness I will never forget. "I was there when she was frightened. I was there when she was lucid. I was there when you were deciding which version of her was most convenient." The silence after that felt physical. I let it sit. Then I reached into my bag and placed a worn cream envelope on the table. It had been tucked into the lining of one of my grandmother's old needlepoint project bags, found by Teresa when we were unpacking boxes Naomi had subpoenaed from off-site storage. My name was on the front in Eleanor's shaky but unmistakable hand. Richard stared at it like it might explode. I slid it toward Naomi, who opened it carefully with a letter knife and withdrew a folded note. Inside, in my grandmother's hand, dated 6 months before the stroke, was a short instruction. "If Easter is ever moved away from the family table, it is because someone wants witnesses gone. Invite the missing ones first." Daniel let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh and almost like grief. Lydia closed her eyes. Gavin said, "That could mean anything." "No," I said calmly. "It means she saw you coming." He looked at me as if he wanted to lunge across the table. Instead he gripped the edge so hard his knuckles whitened. Celeste recovered enough to sneer. "Even if that note is authentic, it doesn't alter the legal validity of a later amendment." Naomi nodded. "Correct. Which is why we also brought the handwriting analysis, the medication timeline, the access records, the foundation transfer traces, the witness statements, the preserved emails, and a draft referral package to both the Attorney General's Charitable Trust section and the District Attorney. That got Richard's attention more than anything else had. He finally turned to face Naomi fully. "What do you want?" There was. "Not what is true. Not what happened. What do you want?" Naomi did not answer right away. She opened the second document case and removed a settlement packet bound in dark blue. "Cooperation," she said. "Immediate rescission of the March Amendment. Independent forensic administration of the trust. Restoration of beneficiary notice rights. Reconstitution of the Eleanor Mercer Art Fund to its original allocation plus replenishment. Full reimbursement of foundation diversions. Written acknowledgement of improper exclusion of beneficiaries and witnesses. Resignation of Gavin Mercer from fiduciary and operational roles pending audit. Preservation of all devices and correspondence. And mutual non-disparagement limited so as not to obstruct lawful reporting." Gavin half rose from his chair. "Absolutely not." Leo slid one more page across to him. "Then we add the lender package." He looked down. I watched the color leave his face. Because that final page showed what he had hoped no one would ever line up neatly in daylight. He had referenced anticipated internal trust consolidation and a coming easement-related value stabilization when courting extension terms on the Santa Barbara debt. In other words, he had leveraged family asset expectations tied to documents now under challenge. Brooke whispered, "Oh my God." Gavin rounded on her. "Be quiet." "No," she said louder now. "You said none of this touched me. You said my name wasn't on anything." Preston closed his eyes briefly, the way people do when they know the floor has already given way. Richard turned to Gavin. "You used trust expectations in external discussions?" Gavin snapped, "I used family assets to protect family assets." "Somebody had to." Celeste said, "Richard, don't let him panic them." "Panic them?" Brooke's laugh came out sharp and ugly. "You told me Amelia was being difficult because she wanted attention. You said Lydia was delusional. You said Talia was unstable. You said Marisol was resentful. How many women do you have to call crazy before you stop sounding credible?" Celeste went very still. "Brooke." "No," Brooke said, pushing back from the table. "No, don't Brooke me. If criminal referrals are being discussed, I want separate counsel." And there was the group shattering from the inside. Gavin stared at his wife as if betrayal were something that only happened downward. Richard loosened his tie for the first time all morning. Celeste's face hardened into something almost elegant in its cruelty, which meant she was frightened. Preston started whispering urgently to his associate. Brooke was already pulling out her phone. "I sat there and watched the shape of power leave them one person at a time. I made sure you'd find exactly what I wanted you to find," I said. Every eye in the room came back to me. "The flights," I continued. "The car services. The guest list." I knew Celeste would search for surfaces first. I knew Gavin would assume this was leverage because leverage is the only language he respects. I knew you'd all be so focused on who I brought back that you wouldn't ask why I wanted them in the same house at the same time. Richard's voice was rougher now. "You set this up." I held his gaze. "I documented what you were already doing." Gavin let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You invited a bunch of family cast-offs to a cliff house and turned it into a prosecution strategy." "I invited witnesses," I said evenly. Lydia leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other and added, "And the house is lovely." Even Naomi's mouth twitched. Preston tried one last stand. "This is coercive. You are threatening reputational damage to extract concessions." Naomi folded her hands. "No, Mr. Hale. I am offering your clients a confidential civil resolution before the evidentiary record reaches regulators, lenders, the board, and every beneficiary you failed to notify." Richard looked at the harbor, then back at the packet in front of him. Outside, sunlight flashed hard off the water. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly above leather and paper, and old money learning what paper could do to it. He said, "If we sign, this stays private." Naomi's answer was exact. The civil terms remain confidential except as required for audit, regulator contact, lender remediation, tax correction, and lawful family notice. We do not agree to silence regarding criminal exposure if you obstruct, retaliate, or destroy evidence. Celeste turned to him. "Richard, don't you dare." He ignored her. Gavin said, "Dad." Brooke stood fully this time. "I'm calling my own attorney." "No one is calling anyone until we finish here," Preston said too loudly, and it was the wrong move. Brooke stared at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time and sat down only because separate counsel would take time she suddenly understood they did not have. Richard opened the packet. I watched his hands. Same broad hands that used to button my coat when I was little. Same hands that signed tuition checks and condolence letters and now trembled, just barely, over the rescission page. He read longer than the others. Maybe because he finally understood that this was not a tantrum he could wait out. Maybe because he could see, more clearly than the rest of them, what public exposure would do to the Mercer name, the board seats, the club memberships, the charitable gala circuit that had mistaken polish for integrity for decades. Celeste did not read. She skimmed, then pushed the pages away as if contact itself were insulting. "This is extortion." Naomi looked at her. "Then decline it." Celeste's mouth opened, closed, because even she knew what decline meant now. Leo slid signature tabs into place. Blue flags. Yellow initials. Quiet, precise, almost tender in their inevitability. Richard signed first. The pen moved across the page with a faint scratching sound I can still hear if I think about it too hard. Gavin refused for another 4 minutes, demanded revisions, requested adjournment, threatened counterclaims, accused Talia again, accused Naomi of collusion, accused me of orchestrating a family coup. Naomi answered each point once, without emotion. Leo placed the lender page back in front of him. Lydia said nothing. Daniel stared until Gavin's bravado frayed completely. He signed next. Brooke initialed her limited acknowledgments after adding a handwritten reservation of independent rights, which Naomi allowed because Brooke was no longer our problem. Celeste held out longest, not because she had options but because she wanted the room to feel the violence of her compliance. When she finally signed, she pressed so hard the nib nearly tore the paper. Naomi collected the packets and passed a final device preservation notice across to Preston. "We'll have the auditors in by Wednesday," she said. Richard stood. So did I. For one suspended moment, it was just the two of us at opposite ends of the walnut table, morning light between us. He looked older now than his years. Not ruined. Men like him were rarely ruined by one day. But altered. Stripped of presumption. "You enjoyed this," Celeste said from behind him. I turned to her. "No," I said. "I respected it." She frowned, not understanding. I looked back at my father. "You taught me family was about stewardship." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I just believed you." Then I picked up my bag, nodded to Naomi, and walked out. Behind me, the room broke into smaller panics. Brooke already hissing into her phone. Gavin demanding copies. Preston calling someone from the hallway. Celeste saying my name once, sharp as broken glass. I didn't answer. Next time I thought, make sure the people carrying your secrets aren't working for both sides. 6 months later, the mornings at Cypress House had a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. The kitchen windows caught the first light before the ocean side did, so dawn arrived as a pale wash over stone and oak before it reached the cliffs. I would wake to the low hum of the coffee grinder, pad barefoot across heated floors, and take my mug out to the east terrace while the marine layer still clung low over the ravines. Some mornings the sky came up pearl gray. Some mornings gold. On the best ones, the sun broke through in clean bands and turned the railing warm under my palms. There is a particular kind of peace in standing above the Pacific with hot coffee in your hand and no one left to impress. By then, the settlement had done exactly what Naomi said it would do. Not loudly. Not all at once. But thoroughly. Richard stepped down as chairman of Mercer Hospitality 3 weeks after the auditors began. Officially, it was to focus on family matters and governance transition. Unofficially, the lender package and foundation review made him radioactive in every room where reputation functioned as currency. He kept his suits, his houses, his golf swing, his clipped way of speaking. What he lost was deference. At the preserve, men who used to rise when he approached started pretending not to see him. At charity dinners, women who once angled for his table now smiled with careful pity and kept walking. Old money hates scandal, but it hates administrative scandal most of all. Affairs are forgivable. Sloppy paper is not. Celeste tried to survive through aesthetics. For a while she almost managed it. She hosted one luncheon in Hillsborough with too many orchids and not enough guests. She appeared at a museum fundraiser in cream silk and a diamond riviere that felt like a dare. She posted photographs from her garden with captions about grace and renewal. None of it took. People stopped inviting her to sit on decorative committees. The board of the Eleanor Mercer Art Fund, restored under the settlement and no longer under her soft control, declined her informal involvement. By midsummer, the women who had once copied her floral palettes were crossing the street to avoid being seen in conversation with her. It turns out social exile in her world is just a series of very polite absences. Gavin lost more. The Santa Barbara expansion stalled under audit pressure and lender review. Once the internal transfers came under scrutiny, several institutional partners demanded distance. He resigned as COO before they could formally remove him and told anyone who would listen that he was pursuing entrepreneurial opportunities. In reality, he spent most of that summer trying to salvage credibility with men who had already decided he was reckless. He had been raised to believe bluster was leadership. Outside a family system built to excuse him, it read as panic. Brooke lasted another 8 weeks. Then she filed for separation and retained a publicist before she retained interior movers, which told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. She made exactly one statement through a representative about misalignment of values, and then quietly began repositioning herself as a lifestyle figure focused on resilience. The internet, being what it is, was less charmed than she expected. Her sponsorships thinned. Not vanished. Just diminished. Enough to sting. Preston Hale entered what Naomi described as the find-out phase of his career. His firm did not disbar him, of course. Men in loafers and old ties rarely suffered that quickly. But he was removed from certain sensitive files and encouraged to take a leave that everyone pretended was restorative. Last I heard, he was doing advisory work for smaller private clients who cared more about discretion than excellence, which is a softer landing than he deserved but a colder one than he had planned. And then there were the quieter consequences. The enablers. The people who had forwarded drafts, changed locks, passed along guest list rumors, repeated Celeste's version because proximity to power felt safer than truth. Some lost positions. Some lost sleep. A few sent me messages that were half apology, half self-defense. I archived those too. The communication attempts from the central players came in waves. First the threats. From Gavin, "You've overplayed this. You have no idea what disclosure cuts both ways." From Celeste, "You may have secured signatures but you will never secure dignity." From Richard, "Public conflict helps no one. Call me." Then the bargaining. From Richard again, "We can still preserve what matters." From Brooke, "I know we've both been manipulated. I'd like to talk woman to woman." From Gavin, midnight on a Tuesday, "If you wanted me out, you got it. Are you satisfied now?" Finally, when summer had almost tipped into fall, the nostalgia. From Richard, "The family isn't the same." From Celeste, astonishingly, "Easter should never have become this." From an unknown number I recognized as Brooke's assistant routing around a block. "I miss how things were before all this ugliness." I never answered any of them. I archived, exported, and stored everything in a secure folder Naomi jokingly labeled Mercer Weather Systems because each message arrived like a change in pressure you could predict if you understood the season. The best updates came indirectly anyway. One Tuesday in August, Lydia called while I was reviewing intake notes at my office in Monterey. By then I had turned 2 floors of a restored brick building above Alvarado Street into Cairn House Advisory, a boutique practice focused on estate transparency, fiduciary oversight, and elder financial abuse prevention. I hadn't meant to start a business when all of this began. But somewhere between assembling timelines and watching how easily respectable people manipulate capacity, access, and silence, I realized how many families needed someone calm enough to document what everyone else was trying to smooth over. We started small. Naomi referred the legal matters outside her conflict range. A geriatric care manager in Santa Cruz sent us our first high-net-worth coercion case. Then a family office in Napa hired us to review trust communication protocols after a suspicious amendment. By September I had 2 investigators, 1 retired probate clerk, Talia as operations director, and a waiting list. People here consulting, and imagine slide decks. What we really offered was structure. Chronologies. Preservation. Questions asked before evidence disappeared. I was good at it because I understood both languages now, the polished one and the truthful one. Lydia called just after noon. "You will enjoy this," she said without greeting. "I usually do. I was at Rancho Market buying peaches, and who do I see in the prepared foods aisle but Celeste Mercer in oversized sunglasses trying to pretend she doesn't notice 2 women from the museum board discussing her at medium volume near the olives. I leaned back in my chair. The office smelled like paper, bergamot tea, and the salt air that slipped in whenever someone opened the windows too wide. "Did she notice you?" "Oh, completely. I picked up the expensive balsamic just to prolong the moment." I laughed. Lydia's voice softened. "Your mother would have loved you like this, you know. There are griefs that stay quiet until someone speaks to them gently." I turned toward the window and watched a gull wheel over the harbor. "I know," I said. Another time it was Daniel. He had come out to Big Sur for a long weekend in October, leaving Micah with the twins and showing up with fresh figs, 2 linen shirts, and gossip packaged like pastry. We were standing at the kitchen counter under warm pendant light while he reduced a sauce and I sliced fennel for a salad. "You will not believe who I just saw in San Francisco," he said. "If it's a Mercer, disappoint me slowly." Preston Hale. Alone. At the hotel bar in the Palace. Talking very earnestly to a 28-year-old founder in sneakers who looked like he thought Preston was the valet. I set the knife down. "Cruel. Accurate," Daniel said. "The universe has moved him from patriarchal menace to overfamiliar networking uncle. Nature is healing." By then even Marisol had begun to sound lighter when she called. She joined the restored Eleanor Mercer Art Fund as community programming coordinator after the board asked for recommendations and I gave them only one name. The first time she unlocked the gallery storage room with her own key, she sent me a picture of her hand on the brass handle and a message that simply read, "She would have liked this." Evan stayed the most distant but in a healthy way. He didn't want rescuing. He wanted acknowledgement and what was owed. He received both through the settlement's revised structure and then returned to Oregon with a better lawyer, a rebuilt shop, and a habit of texting me photographs of repaired boats with captions like "still afloat." That was enough. Sometimes affection grows best at a respectful distance. The person I saw most unexpectedly was Talia. At first our relationship was practical. She understood the archives, the schedules, the petty mechanics of polished dishonesty. She built systems at Cairn House that made my life easier and took notes in meetings with a composure that would have terrified the old version of her. Over time something warmer emerged. Not because we forgot where she had started but because neither of us needed to lie about it. One Friday evening in late September she sat across from me in the office conference room while sunset turned the window glass amber. The table between us was scattered with case files, oat milk lattes, and a bowl of sea salt caramels Daniel had sent down from Chicago because he claimed California needed better taste. Talia was reviewing an intake memo when she stopped mid-sentence and looked up. "Do you ever feel strange," she asked, "that they made us into allies by trying to use us differently?" I considered that. Outside, traffic moved slowly below. Inside, the room glowed gold against the brick. "Yes," I said. "But not bad strange." She nodded. "Me too. That was the thing no one tells you about surviving a family like mine. The aftermath is not only loss. It is also sorting. Once the fear leaves, the real architecture shows. Who was performing loyalty? Who was trading access? Who was kind when it was expensive? Who became family only after the old definition failed?" By November I had stopped checking to see whether Richard was calling from a new number. I had stopped wondering whether Celeste still hosted dinners no one enjoyed. I had stopped caring whether Gavin blamed me publicly or privately. Their lives continued, I'm sure, in the expensive, diminished, carefully lit way such lives do. Mine had moved beyond the radius of their narration. That winter, the first storm of the season hit Big Sur hard enough to rattle the window panes. The Pacific went slate black and violent, white water exploding against the rocks below the cliff. I stood in the living room with a blanket around my shoulders and felt only gratitude for reinforced glass and foundations sunk deep into stone. Teresa was away with her sister for the weekend. The house was silent except for weather and the occasional hum of the heating system. My phone buzzed at 8:41 p.m. Richard. I almost let it go to archive automatically. Then I answered not because I owed him that, but because curiosity had finally become stronger than dread. His voice came through tired and formal. I didn't expect you to pick up. I know. Pause. Wind hissed softly against my windows. I was driving back from Atherton, he said. I passed the old church where your mother insisted on stopping every Easter because she liked the daffodils in the side yard. I thought of you. I said nothing. Then he did something my father had almost never done in my life. He asked a direct question without wrapping it in authority. Are you happy? I looked out at the storm, at the warm light reflected over my own living room, at the absence of fear in my body. Yes, I said. The silence on the line lengthened. I see, he said finally. That was all. No apology. No defense. No mention of the documents or the signatures or the women he had allowed to be dismissed in order to preserve convenience. But the question itself told me more than an apology might have. Somewhere inside the ruins of his certainty, he had finally understood that control and love were not interchangeable. When I hung up, I